She was standing in my grandfather's study, right where his boots used to sit, on the day of his funeral. I was still in my suit, and this stranger with a clipboard was screaming that I couldn't just inherit 150 acres and do what I wanted. She was about to issue a violation that would make my blood run cold. What would you do if this happened on your property? The smell of pine and old leather was still fresh in the house. I was drowning in grief, reading Grandpa Harold's will one final time, when the front door just opened. No knock. A woman in her 50s marched straight into his study, like she owned the place. Mr. Grant. Olivia Sharp, Meadowbrook Estates HOA. We have compliance issues that require your immediate attention, she barked. Her voice had that particular blend of false authority and genuine entitlement that makes you check your wallet. She demanded I remove the porch swing, trim the historic oak my great-grandfather planted, and then she said the words I'll never forget. The family cemetery in your west pasture must be relocated to an approved facility within 60 days. My brain stopped. Did she just tell me to dig up my own family? On the day we buried my grandfather? That's when I knew this wasn't about rules. This was a takeover, and I was about to discover my grandfather had been preparing for this fight for decades. You can't just inherit land and do whatever you want with it. That's what she screamed, hands on hips, standing right where my grandfather's boots used to sit. I hadn't even unpacked yet. The smell of pine and old leather was still fresh in the hallway. But this HOA enforcer had already marched onto my porch, clipboard in hand, barking codes and citing landscaping violations like I was a tenant she planned to evict. It felt unreal, entitled, and honestly dangerous. My grandfather, Harold Grant, left me everything when he passed last Tuesday. The ranch house, the 150 acres, the cattle operation that had fed our family since 1875. What he didn't warn me about was inheriting a neighbor from hell who thought she owned the entire county. I was sitting in his old leather chair, still wearing my funeral suit from that morning, reading through his will one final time. The lawyer had left an hour ago, and I was finally alone with the weight of what I'd inherited when the front door just opened without so much as a knock. A woman in her early 50s marched straight into Harold's study, like she owned the place. Clipboard in one hand, attitude that could strip paint in the other, and absolutely zero acknowledgement that she'd just committed a felony by entering someone's private residence without permission. She looked around Harold's study with the expression of a health inspector who had found violations everywhere she turned. I sat there in complete shock, wondering if grief was making me hallucinate, a cold fury settling in my stomach. Strangers wandering through my inherited property like they were conducting some kind of official inspection tour. Mr. Grant, I'm Olivia Sharp, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, she announced, settling into Harold's reading chair without any invitation. Her voice carried that blend of fake authority that makes normal people check their wallets instinctively. I'm here to discuss immediate compliance issues with your property that require attention before they impact our community property values. I honestly wasn't sure if I should laugh or call 911 because this woman was treating criminal trespassing like a routine business appointment. Harold's ranch had been in our family since before the Civil War ended. The property deed in his desk drawer was signed by my great-great-grandfather in 1875, registered with territorial authorities, and confirmed by every county clerk in statehood. Meadowbrook Estates was a subdivision built in the late 1990s on what used to be Johnson's wheat farm, separated from our ranch by a clear property line that appeared on every survey map filed with the county. But apparently Olivia had different ideas about boundaries, and she was about to share every single one of them. She flipped through her clipboard like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a grand jury. A first item: that porch swing on your front veranda needs immediate removal. Our architectural guidelines prohibit outdoor furniture visible from community streets, and your swing creates aesthetic inconsistency for residents driving past your property. I sat there trying to process the logic of someone demanding I remove furniture from my own porch to improve the scenery for strangers. It was like being told to rearrange my living room because people walking past my windows might disapprove of my interior decorating choices. Second item involves the oak tree by your front gate, which requires substantial trimming to match neighborhood sightline requirements established by our landscape committee, She continued, making additional notes on her papers like she was documenting official code violations. That oak tree had been planted by Harold's father in 1923 to commemorate surviving the Spanish flu pandemic. The thing was older than most buildings in town, probably worth more than her entire subdivision, but she wanted it trimmed to match community landscaping preferences. I was beginning to understand why Harold always kept that shotgun by his front door. Third item is non-negotiable. The family cemetery in your west pasture must be relocated to an approved municipal facility within 60 days to comply with residential development standards. My brain just stopped working entirely when she said that. This woman had demanded I dig up my great-great-grandfather's grave to improve her neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. I actually had to replay that sentence several times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding her meaning, because surely nobody was deranged enough to make cemetery relocation demands during someone's mourning period. I should probably mention, I said, leaning back in Harold's chair with what must have been obvious disbelief. I'm actually Governor Grant. You might recognize me from news coverage or state events. Her reaction was exactly what I'd expected from someone who just committed criminal trespassing against a sitting governor. She blinked twice, processed that information for about 5 seconds, then continued reading from her clipboard like I'd mentioned my favorite television show. Governor or not, Mr. Grant, you're subject to the same community guidelines as every other property owner in this area. She replied with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered actual consequences for threatening elected officials. The Meadowbrook HOA operates under delegated state authority to maintain property values and neighborhood consistency throughout our jurisdiction. I couldn't help smiling at her claim about state authority, considering I literally controlled the government powers she was pretending to represent. I stood up and walked to Harold's oak desk where he had always maintained his important legal documents in perfect organizational order. The ranch deed was right there in the top drawer, along with survey maps dating back to territorial establishment and correspondence with multiple law firms about protecting the property's historic agricultural status. Olivia watched me gather these papers with the expression of someone who'd never seen actual property documentation before. Her confidence wavered slightly when she realized I wasn't intimidated by her clipboard full of pseudo-authority. These survey maps show property boundaries established in 1875 and confirmed by state historic preservation boards, I explained, spreading Harold's documents across his desk where she could examine them properly. The ranch operates under agricultural heritage protection that supersedes any subdivision regulations. She glanced at Harold's legal papers for perhaps 10 seconds before dismissing them entirely, which told me everything I needed to know about her understanding of property law and historic preservation statutes. Harold's desk had a locked safe built into the bottom drawer that I'd never seen open during my entire childhood. The combination was written inside his will along with a note about emergency property protection documents. I decided to explore that safe later because Harold wasn't someone who prepared for legal emergencies unless he'd anticipated serious challenges to ranch ownership. Whatever was locked in there had been waiting for exactly this kind of situation. Walking Olivia to the front door felt like escorting an intruder off the premises after catching them mid-burglary. I made sure to document her license plate number as she climbed into her white sedan and spent nearly 15 minutes sitting in my driveway, probably coordinating with whoever else was involved in this harassment scheme. Through Harold's front window, I watched her making animated phone calls while staring at the ranch house like she was planning a military assault. The rational response would have been filing criminal charges immediately. Olivia had committed trespassing by entering my home without permission, made false claims about legal authority over protected historic property, and threatened destruction of a family cemetery during my grandfather's mourning period. Any prosecutor would have filed felony charges within hours. But I kept thinking about her systematic approach to this harassment and wondering what other creative crimes she might attempt if given enough rope to completely destroy herself. I had a choice. Arrest her now for one crime or let her dig a hole deep enough for 20. Harold always said that good fences make good neighbors, but he never mentioned what happens when bad neighbors decide to destroy your fences completely. His security system had been quietly recording everything since Olivia's criminal performance in his study. And I was about to discover that watching crimes unfold on high-definition video provides almost as much satisfaction as catching criminals red-handed. The motion sensor started pinging alerts on my phone before 7 that morning, indicating activity along our west property line, where nothing should have been moving except cattle. I grabbed Harold's old hunting binoculars and moved to the kitchen window, where I could observe without being spotted from the main road. Two men in work coveralls were approaching our fence with wire cutters and what looked like professional surveying equipment, moving with the methodical precision of people following detailed instructions. They weren't random vandals hoping for quick destruction. These guys knew exactly which fence sections to target and why, which meant someone had hired them specifically to sabotage ranch operations in ways that would cause maximum disruption. She wasn't just cutting wire. She knew exactly where to snip, how to destabilize the gate, and how to make it look accidental. That's not HOA enforcement. That's targeted sabotage. The security cameras positioned along that fence line were capturing everything in perfect detail. Harold had installed professional-grade surveillance equipment 5 years back when cattle theft became a regional problem. And that investment was about to generate returns he'd probably never imagined. Wide-angle shots, crystal clear audio, facial recognition quality video, and GPS timestamps that would make any prosecutor absolutely delighted to build criminal cases around such comprehensive evidence. I didn't wait. I forwarded the footage to Owen, but also blind copied it to a local journalist I'd met 2 years ago while hosting a town hall. Her stories had taken down 2 corrupt city councilmen. I figured she might enjoy a HOA scandal. My phone buzzed with a text from the same number Olivia had used yesterday. Property correction crew working today. Do not interfere with compliance improvements. 60-day deadline for full standards implementation remains firm. I started laughing while reading that message because she had just documented criminal conspiracy in writing. Again, the woman was systematically creating evidence against herself with every communication. Like someone determined to make prosecution as easy as possible for district attorneys. The men worked their way along our fence line with disturbing efficiency. They cut wire in precise sections, removed posts without damaging the concrete foundations, and stacked everything neatly like they were planning to return later for cleanup work. The older worker kept checking his phone and pointing toward different areas, clearly following instructions from someone coordinating this operation remotely. Their truck had magnetic signs reading Meadowbrook Property Services, which was either the boldest criminal stupidity I'd ever witnessed or complete confidence in their legal immunity. I called my legal team while watching these criminals dismantle Harold's property boundaries like they were performing routine maintenance. My chief counsel answered immediately, probably recognizing the governor's emergency line on his caller identification system. "What's the situation, Governor?" he asked, and I could hear him reaching for legal pads before I'd even started explaining. "I'm watching felony property destruction happen in real time," I told him. "Criminal conspiracy, organized vandalism, probably fraud, all documented on professional security footage with perfect audio quality." Explaining Olivia's cemetery relocation demands took several minutes, during which the fence destruction crew managed to eliminate nearly 400 feet of ranch boundary. My attorney was completely silent when I finished describing her threats against Harold's grave site. "Governor, you're describing coordinated felonies against protected historic property by someone falsely claiming government authority," he finally said. "We can execute arrest warrants within 2 hours if you authorize immediate prosecution." But I wasn't ready for immediate arrests because Olivia obviously had additional crimes planned and I wanted comprehensive documentation. The security footage was capturing conversations between the workers that revealed interesting details about their employer's instructions. She said, "Focus on sections near the old cemetery first, then work back toward the main house if nobody shows up to complain," the younger one mentioned while loading cut fence wire onto their truck. That comment alone would be worth significant prison time when this reached court because it showed premeditated targeting of the family burial site for maximum emotional impact. Around noon, both men packed their equipment and drove away, leaving calling cards in the form of Meadowbrook Estates business signs at the scene of their crime. They'd essentially sign their names to felony property destruction, which suggested either complete ignorance about criminal consequences or absolute confidence that their employer had legal protection for whatever harassment campaign she was orchestrating. Either way, they'd provided perfect identification for law enforcement when arrests eventually happened. I spent the afternoon creating backup copies of security footage and preparing evidence packages for legal proceedings. The cameras had recorded license plates, clear facial identification, detailed conversations about Olivia's specific instructions, and precise timestamps for every moment of fence destruction. Watching criminals coordinate property crimes through digital communication was like observing someone construct their own prison sentence piece by piece. Every recorded word, every text message, every second of vandalism was building evidence that would be impossible to dispute in court. The most interesting aspect wasn't the actual fence damage, which could be repaired within a week for relatively modest cost. What fascinated me was the systematic methodology behind Olivia's harassment campaign. She'd researched ranch operations enough to target fence lines that would disrupt cattle management without causing structural damage, expensive enough to trigger immediate police response. She'd hired workers familiar with rural sabotage techniques who could complete destruction quickly while minimizing their exposure time on the property. Harold's study contained filing cabinets I'd barely explored during childhood visits, including legal correspondences spanning decades of ranch ownership challenges. Previous HOA presidents had attempted similar harassment campaigns, but nothing approaching Olivia's level of criminal audacity. Most had limited themselves to strongly worded letters about tree trimming or livestock management. Nobody before had escalated to actual property destruction or threatened cemetery desecration during family mourning periods. By evening, I'd organized complete evidence packages showing criminal conspiracy, property destruction, false claims about legal authority, and documentation of every text message Olivia had sent threatening further harassment. My legal team confirmed that we had sufficient evidence for immediate arrests and serious felony charges. But something told me this was only the beginning of whatever elaborate scheme she developed for acquiring Harold's ranch property through intimidation and legal harassment. The security system continued recording all night, capturing footage of Olivia making multiple drive-by inspections of the damaged fence areas. She stopped her car 3 separate times to photograph the destruction and make notes on fresh paperwork, probably documenting evidence for whatever insurance fraud or false legal claims she planned to file next. The woman was building a comprehensive record of her own criminal activity that would make conviction easier than most prosecutors encounter during their entire careers. Watching them destroy my property on camera, I realized each video frame was worth about $5,000 in court. An hour later, Owen called me, not to talk about the footage, but to warn me. Someone inside the HA office had leaked our email chain to Olivia, and she was already planning her next move. By Thursday morning, I'd reached my limit with Olivia's criminal entertainment program. Watching someone systematically destroy inherited property while documenting crimes stops being amusing when you realize they're planning indefinite escalation. While Owen worked the restraining order, I called Darren, a retired postal inspector with a quiet grudge against HOA frauds. I asked him to play a curious new buyer interested in Olivia's next development project. I needed to know how far this went. The courthouse steps at dawn felt like entering battle formation. My chief counsel carried evidence folders containing security footage, property documentation, and Olivia's text messages confessing to criminal conspiracy. The duty clerk recognized my voice immediately, probably because governors don't file personal legal actions without serious justification. We need immediate restraining orders against Olivia Sharp and associates involved in ongoing criminal harassment of protected state property, my attorney explained while spreading evidence across the reception desk. Judge Morrison had handled property disputes in this county for 20 years, but his expression suggested he'd never encountered someone demanding cemetery relocation from a sitting governor during family mourning. He reviewed our evidence with methodical attention that serious judges apply to cases involving elected officials and felony charges. Governor Grant, you're describing systematic criminal harassment by someone falsely claiming government authority over historically protected ranch property, he said after examining Harold's deed. This court will provide legal protection. The restraining order hearing lasted under 30 minutes, mainly because Olivia hadn't hired legal representation for defending against charges she didn't know were coming. Judge Morrison watched security footage of fence destruction with increasing amazement, especially audio, where her crew discussed targeting cemetery areas for maximum emotional impact. Miss Sharp, you're prohibited from any contact with Governor Grant's property, person, or family members pending criminal investigation, he announced, while signing protection orders that would make future harassment impossible without immediate arrest. When I dropped off the paperwork at the HA office, Olivia didn't even flinch. She smiled like she'd just been promoted. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked, fingernails tapping her clipboard. I didn't answer. The judge would. Her voice carried that particular blend of false authority and genuine entitlement that makes normal people check their wallets instinctively. Even facing felony charges, she couldn't admit HOA authority doesn't extend to other people's private property. Deputy Martinez was assigned to serve protection orders and explained legal consequences in terms Olivia couldn't misunderstand. Martinez had handled harassment cases for 15 years, and his expression suggested he'd never encountered someone claiming HOA authority over a governor's historic ranch. Miss Sharp, any violation results in immediate arrest and additional felony charges, he explained, while Olivia insisted community compliance took precedence over legal protection orders. I drove back to Harold's ranch, feeling like I deployed nuclear weapons against someone throwing rocks. The restraining order prohibited Olivia from contacting me, approaching ranch boundaries, or coordinating activities affecting our agricultural operations. Violating restrictions would result in immediate arrest and supplementary charges that could extend her prison sentence by years. But watching her read those papers, I suspected this woman wasn't intelligent enough to recognize complete defeat. Harold's locked safe contained documents that explained why he'd been preparing for this specific legal challenge. Letters from state preservation officials, federal agricultural designations, and correspondence with attorney general offices about protecting ranch operations from development pressure. Harold had anticipated property acquisition attempts through systematic harassment, building legal defenses that would make such attacks impossible to sustain. That evening, my security systems detected Olivia conducting surveillance in direct violation of her restraining order. She drove past our main gate 3 times, stopping to photograph fence repairs and make notes. Each pass was another violation resulting in immediate arrest potential, and she was accumulating contempt charges faster than most criminals manage during entire careers. I called Deputy Martinez reporting real-time restraining order violations. "Governor, we can execute arrest warrants immediately if you want maximum enforcement," he said after I described continued surveillance activities. "She's provided enough evidence for serious contempt charges that would add years to her sentence." But I was thinking that letting her accumulate additional violations might prove more satisfying than stopping criminal behavior before it reached spectacular levels of legal stupidity. Security footage showed Olivia's sedan making multiple reconnaissance trips past ranch boundaries, each time stopping for photographs that violated every aspect of her protection order. She was documenting her own contempt of court, convinced that continued harassment would reverse her legal catastrophe instead of making her situation exponentially worse. By midnight, she'd violated court orders 17 different times in ways recorded on high-definition footage with precise timestamps. The next morning, I found tire tracks on the western edge of the cemetery path where no one had driven in decades, and a small orange flag stuck into the soil near my grandfather's stone. While I had been focused on building legal cases against Olivia, something interesting was happening in the Meadowbrook subdivision that I hadn't anticipated. Turns out Harold's ranch wasn't the only target of Olivia's creative interpretation of HOA authority. And her neighbors were starting to organize their own resistance movement that had nothing to do with my criminal prosecution efforts. Instead of more angry texts, people started printing flyers. They posted screenshots of HOA violations on street pools. By noon, someone had launched a petition titled, "Remove Olivia Sharp, Restore Respect." It had 400 signatures by dinner. Ella Dawson lived 3 houses down from Olivia in a modest 2-story colonial that she'd been renovating slowly over the past decade. 40-some, worked as a middle school teacher, and apparently possessed the organizational skills that come from managing 7th graders who think rules are suggestions. She'd been quietly documenting Olivia's harassment of various neighbors for months, building files that would make prosecutors jealous if they ever became evidence in criminal proceedings. But Ella wasn't planning to wait for the legal system to solve problems she could address through community organizing. The trouble started when Olivia decided that Ella's vegetable garden violated subdivision aesthetic standards and demanded immediate removal of all food-producing plants. According to her interpretation of community guidelines, residential properties should maintain purely decorative landscaping that matches neighborhood character rather than practical gardens that served actual household purposes. Ella had been growing tomatoes, peppers, and herbs in her backyard for 15 years without any complaints from previous HOA leadership, but Olivia considered vegetable gardens inconsistent with upscale community image. She showed up at my door Tuesday morning with a violation notice demanding I remove every food plant by Friday or face fines starting at $200 daily, Ella told me when she called that Wednesday afternoon. Her voice carried the controlled anger of someone who had reached their breaking point with authoritarian nonsense. "Hayden, I've been teaching kids about responsible citizenship for 20 years, and this woman makes middle school bullies look reasonable." That's when I realized Olivia had been systematically harassing multiple neighbors while I'd been dealing with her ranch property crimes. One man handed me a photo of his father fishing with mine, right by the creek Olivia now claimed was HOA property. "Don't let her erase us," he said. Ella had organized a neighborhood meeting for Thursday evening to discuss community leadership, accountability, and resident rights protection. By the time I drove past her house that night, nearly 30 cars were parked along streets that usually saw minimal traffic after dinner time. Through her front windows, I could see people holding paperwork and speaking with the animated gestures that indicate serious grievances being aired publicly for the first time. The meeting agenda was more comprehensive than most city council sessions. Residents had compiled documentation of unauthorized fee collections, arbitrary rule changes, violation notices for imaginary infractions, and demands for property modifications that exceeded any reasonable interpretation of HOA authority. Olivia had been running Meadowbrook like a personal dictatorship, implementing policies without resident input and threatening legal action against anyone who questioned her increasingly authoritarian leadership style. Mrs. Patterson from Maple Street had received demands to remove her flower boxes for blocking sight lines that didn't exist. The Rodriguez family was being fined for parking their work van in their own driveway because it violated aesthetic standards never voted on by community members. Bob Williams faced demands to remove his American flag for exceeding approved decoration guidelines that weren't mentioned anywhere in original HOA documentation. Every household had stories about Olivia's creative rule enforcement. "She's been collecting special assessment fees for community improvements that never happen," announced Jim Foster, who'd been tracking HOA financial records with the attention to detail that comes from 40 years in accounting. Drainage projects that were never started, landscaping contracts with companies that don't exist, legal fees for services nobody authorized. The room went completely silent when residents realized their HOA president had probably been stealing community funds while threatening them with legal action for questioning her authority. Ella stood up with a folder thick enough to choke a horse containing what looked like months of investigation into Olivia's leadership methods. "I've contacted the State Consumer Protection Office about unauthorized financial collections and possible fraud in HOA management," she announced to applause that probably woke neighbors 3 blocks away. "We're also filing complaints about harassment tactics that violate resident rights under state homeowner protection statutes." The Meadowbrook community wasn't just organizing resistance. They were mounting a legal offensive. The most interesting revelation came from Tom Bradley, whose background in construction management had given him insight into building codes and zoning regulations. Half the violations she's citing aren't real requirements. he explained while showing official county documentation. Architectural standards she claims are mandatory don't appear anywhere in filed HOA covenants or county building codes. She's been making up rules and threatening legal action for violations that exist only in her imagination. By the end of that meeting, residents had voted unanimously to demand Olivia's immediate resignation and schedule new HOA leadership elections within 30 days. They had compiled evidence of financial mismanagement, harassment campaigns against multiple families, and systematic violation of resident rights that would support both civil lawsuits and criminal charges. The community was taking back control of their neighborhood from someone who had been treating elected HOA position like absolute monarchy. That night, a newsletter slipped under every door announced a mandatory compliance review meeting hosted by Olivia. I knew that tone. It wasn't a meeting. It was a purge. Monday morning brought the kind of phone call that changes everything in criminal cases. My chief of staff knocked on my office door with an expression that suggested either very good news or complete catastrophe. And honestly, I wasn't sure which possibility made me more nervous. "Governor, the state attorney's office has someone who wants to make a deal," he said, closing the door behind him with unusual care. "Martin Greer is downstairs asking for immunity in exchange for testimony about conspiracy and fraud involving your ranch property situation." I'd never heard Martin Greer's name before that moment, but apparently he'd been coordinating with Olivia from the beginning of her harassment campaign. The man waiting in my conference room looked like every development consultant I'd ever met during my political career. Expensive suit, nervous energy, and the kind of desperate charm that appears when someone realizes their criminal enterprise is about to collapse around them like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Governor Grant, I want to be completely transparent about my involvement in the Meadowbrook situation. Before this goes any further," Martin began, spreading documents across my conference table with shaking hands. "Olivia Sharp contacted me 6 months ago about acquiring your grandfather's ranch for resort development, and I provided consulting services that may have exceeded legal boundaries." That's a diplomatic way of saying he'd been coordinating criminal harassment of government property while helping plan fraud schemes that would make federal prosecutors absolutely delighted. Martin's confession unfolded like watching someone disassemble a bomb while explaining how they'd built it originally. He'd been working with Olivia to identify legal vulnerabilities in Harold's property ownership, researching ways to force a sale through systematic harassment and false claims about zoning violations. The fence cutting, cemetery threats, and fake compliance demands were all part of a coordinated strategy to make ranch operations impossible until I surrendered and accepted their below-market purchase offer. "We researched your grandfather's financial situation and determined he couldn't afford extended legal battles against HOA enforcement actions," Martin explained, apparently unaware that Harold had been building legal defenses for exactly this scenario. "The plan was escalating harassment until you agreed to sell at agricultural land prices instead of development value, which would save our investors approximately $12 million in acquisition costs." I sat there listening to this man describe criminal conspiracy like he was explaining market research methodology. The documents Martin provided showed detailed timelines for harassment escalation, financial projections for forced property acquisition, and correspondence with investors who'd been funding this criminal enterprise from the beginning. Olivia hadn't been acting alone or making impulsive decisions about ranch harassment. She'd been following a systematic plan designed by development professionals who understood exactly how to use HOA authority as a weapon against property owners. "I have recordings of planning meetings with Olivia where we discuss specific strategies for making your ranch operations financially unsustainable," Martin continued. Producing a digital device that probably contained enough evidence to support federal conspiracy charges, property destruction, legal harassment, false regulatory claims, even plans for contaminating your water supply if other methods failed to force a sale. That last comment made my blood run cold because these people had been planning crimes that could have killed livestock and endangered human health. Martin's cooperation was motivated by pure self-preservation rather than any moral awakening about criminal behavior. Federal investigators had started examining his business records after our restraining order triggered interest in Olivia's false government authority claims. Rather than face conspiracy charges that could result in decades of prison time, he was offering complete cooperation in exchange for immunity deals that would let him testify against Olivia without facing prosecution himself. The recordings Martin provided were better than Christmas morning for building comprehensive criminal cases. Hours of planning conversations where Olivia discussed targeting ranch operations, coordinating with hired crews, and developing strategies for forcing property sales through systematic intimidation. Every meeting had been recorded, every criminal plan documented, and every conspiracy participant identified by name. Martin had essentially been building prosecution evidence while planning crimes. My attorney arrived within the hour to formalize Martin's cooperation agreement and begin extracting every detail about Olivia's criminal organization. Governor, this testimony will support federal conspiracy charges, fraud prosecution, and probably organized crime allegations, he explained while reviewing Martin's evidence packages. We're looking at conspiracy involving multiple states, federal property crimes, and systematic abuse of public trust. Olivia's harassment campaign was evolving into the kind of case that makes prosecutors' careers. She's planning something major for this weekend, Martin said, checking his phone nervously like he expected Olivia to burst through my office door at any moment. I pulled out of the operation after your restraining order, but she's convinced that one big gesture will force you to negotiate or create enough public pressure to make you back down from criminal charges. The man was describing escalation that would make previous fence cutting look like minor pranks. Martin left my office wearing recording equipment that would capture every word of his conversations with Olivia while she planned whatever spectacular criminal finale she thought would resolve her legal problems. Federal investigators were coordinating with state prosecutors to monitor the situation and gather additional evidence for charges that would ensure Olivia never harassed another property owner again. The woman had no idea her conspiracy partner was about to become the primary witness for her destruction. When criminals turn on each other, that's when you know justice is about to win big. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that made Harold's Ranch look like a postcard advertisement for American agricultural heritage. I'd planned a small memorial gathering to honor his life and officially dedicate the restored ranch operations to preserving everything he'd built over 8 decades of careful stewardship. About 20 neighbors and family friends were expected for the afternoon ceremony, including several community leaders who'd supported our family through years of various challenges. What I hadn't planned was Olivia Sharp making her dramatic entrance like an uninvited wedding crasher. She appeared at our front gate around noon, driving a rental truck loaded with what looked like moving equipment and accompanied by 3 men I didn't recognize. This was clearly the final phase that Martin had mentioned during his cooperation sessions with federal investigators. The recording equipment he was wearing had captured Olivia describing plans for a definitive confrontation that will resolve property compliance issues permanently. Apparently, she decided that direct action would succeed where legal harassment had failed spectacularly. The rental truck stopped just outside our property line, which technically kept Olivia from violating her restraining order, while still allowing maximum intimidation value for whatever performance she'd planned. She climbed out wearing what looked like official inspector clothing, complete with clipboard and measuring equipment that suggested she intended to conduct some kind of fraudulent property assessment. The men with her started unloading surveying gear and posts that were obviously meant for establishing new boundary markers without any legal authority whatsoever. Governor Grant, she called out from the road, projecting her voice like she was addressing a political rally instead of committing crimes in front of witnesses. I'm here to conduct mandatory compliance inspection as authorized by state development standards and community protection regulations. I actually started laughing when she said that because the woman was claiming authority she didn't possess while standing next to equipment for crimes she was about to commit in front of my guests. My memorial gathering guests were arriving just as Olivia began her unauthorized inspection theater. These were people who'd known Harold for decades, respected his contributions to agricultural heritage preservation, and understood exactly how much our family ranch meant to local history. Watching some stranger with fake authority threaten our property during Harold's memorial celebration was generating exactly the kind of community outrage that Olivia should have anticipated if she'd possessed any political intelligence whatsoever. That woman doesn't have authority to inspect anything on your property, announced retired Judge Peterson, who'd driven 2 hours to attend Harold's memorial. What she's describing sounds like criminal impersonation of government officials, which carries serious federal penalties. Other guests were pulling out phones to record Olivia's performance, probably sensing they were witnessing something that would become evidence in criminal proceedings. Olivia ignored the growing crowd of witnesses and began placing surveying stakes along what she claimed were corrected property boundaries based on current community development standards. Each stake was being placed on ranch land that had belonged to our family since territorial establishment, essentially marking areas she intended to claim for her subdivision expansion project. The woman was committing surveyor fraud in front of 20 people while violating restraining orders that prohibited any contact with ranch property. I walked down to the fence line where Olivia was directing her crew's illegal surveying operation. Standing face to face with her for the first time since courthouse proceedings felt like confronting someone who'd completely lost touch with reality. "Miss Sharp, you're violating court orders by approaching this property," I said loud enough for all the witnesses to hear clearly. "Every action you're taking right now is being recorded and will result in additional criminal charges. Governor or not, Mr. Grant, you're subject to the same community guidelines as every other property owner in this area," she replied with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered actual consequences for threatening elected officials. The Meadowbrook HOA operates under delegated state authority to maintain property values and neighborhood consistency throughout our jurisdiction. I couldn't help smiling at her claim about state authority, considering I literally controlled the government powers she was pretending to represent. The situation escalated when Olivia approached Harold's memorial bench, a simple wooden seat he'd placed near our family cemetery for quiet reflection during difficult times. She stepped over the low brick ledge like it meant nothing, kicked aside the potted lilies I had placed last week, and stabbed her flagpole into the earth 2 feet from Harold's name. "This is HOA maintained property now," she declared louder than necessary. That's when my patience with her criminal performance finally reached its absolute breaking point. "Step away from that memorial immediately," I said, positioning myself between Olivia and Harold's bench while guests watched this confrontation unfold in real time. I didn't speak. I walked past her, took my phone out, and opened the live stream app. If she wanted an audience, I'd give her one. "Say that again for the court," I said. Her response was reaching for Harold's memorial bench like she intended to remove it physically, which forced me to block her access to protect something that couldn't be replaced if destroyed. What happened next was the kind of physical confrontation that transforms harassment cases into assault charges. Olivia tried pushing past me to reach Harold's memorial, claiming she had enforcement authority to remove non-compliant structures immediately. I grabbed her wrist to prevent damage to the memorial bench, and she started screaming about being assaulted by government officials who were obstructing legitimate community compliance work. 20 witnesses with recording phones captured every moment of her attempted destruction of family memorial property. The scene that unfolded was like watching someone's complete break from reality happen in slow motion. Olivia continued claiming legal authority to remove Harold's memorial while trying to physically fight her way past me to reach the wooden bench. Her hired crew stood frozen, probably realizing they were witnessing their employer commit assault against a governor while violating court orders in front of multiple witnesses with recording equipment. "Call 911, I told Judge Peterson while maintaining my position between Olivia and Harold's memorial. "We need police response for assault, violation of restraining orders, and attempted destruction of memorial property." Within minutes, sirens were approaching Harold's ranch while Olivia continued screaming about community compliance and government obstruction of legitimate HOA enforcement actions. The police response was swift and decisive. 3 patrol cars, the county sheriff, and Detective Williams, who specialized in harassment and fraud cases involving false government authority claims. Olivia was still claiming legal right to remove Harold's memorial when handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Her hired crew was detained for questioning about their role in systematic property crimes and conspiracy to commit fraud against protected historic agricultural land. Standing between her and grandfather's memorial, I realized some battles can only be fought face to face. She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. "I'll see you at the land reassessment hearing," she said. That hearing wasn't even on the calendar, but I had a bad feeling it would be soon. The emergency community meeting was called for Monday evening at the Meadowbrook Community Center, and by 6 o'clock, the parking lot looked like a political rally. Word had spread through 4 different subdivisions about Olivia's arrest at Harold's Memorial, and residents wanted answers about what their HOA president had been doing in their name. Ella had coordinated with my legal team to present evidence publicly, and tonight would be the first time the entire community learned exactly how extensive Olivia's criminal conspiracy had become. I arrived at the community center to find standing room only with people spilling out into the hallway and others watching through windows from outside. These weren't just Meadowbrook residents anymore. Word about HOA fraud and criminal harassment had attracted homeowners from across the county who dealt with similar authoritarian tactics from elected community leaders. Tonight was going to be more than just a neighborhood meeting. It was going to be a public reckoning. State Attorney Rebecca Chin had agreed to present the criminal case evidence publicly, both to inform residents about charges against their HOA president and to encourage additional victims to come forward with testimony. Attorney Chin was known throughout our state for prosecuting organized crime and public corruption, and her presence at a neighborhood meeting suggested this case had evolved far beyond simple property disputes. When prosecutors of her caliber get involved in community meetings, somebody's going to prison for a very long time. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to present represents one of the most systematic fraud and harassment cases our office has prosecuted involving false government authority, Attorney Chin began, connecting her laptop to projection equipment that would display evidence for the entire community. Olivia Sharp has been operating a criminal enterprise disguised as HI leadership, and many of you have been victims of her illegal activities without realizing the extent of her crimes. The evidence presentation started with Martin's recorded confessions about the resort development conspiracy. The community center went completely silent as residents heard Olivia's own consultant describing plans to acquire Harold's ranch through systematic criminal harassment and property destruction. We identified the ranch as the primary obstacle to resort development and developed strategies to force a sale at the low market prices through coordinated intimidation. Martin's voice explained through the sound system while faces around the room showed increasing shock and anger. Attorney Chen displayed financial records showing how Olivia had been stealing HOA funds to finance her criminal activities, special assessment fees collected for imaginary community improvements, legal expenses for services that were never provided, and maintenance contracts with companies that existed only on paper to hide money transfers to her personal accounts. Over the past 3 years, Ms. Sharp has embezzled approximately $87,000 from community funds while claiming financial transparency, the prosecutor explained, while residents realized they'd been systematically robbed. The security footage from Harold's ranch played on screens throughout the community center, showing Olivia's hired crew destroying fence lines while discussing cemetery targeting for maximum emotional impact. Watching their HOA president coordinate property crimes against a sitting governor during family mourning periods generated exactly the kind of community outrage that destroys political careers permanently. Several residents started crying when they realized how completely they'd been deceived by someone they'd elected to protect their interests. Martin Greer has provided complete cooperation in exchange for immunity, including recordings of planning meetings where Ms. Sharp discussed escalating criminal activities until Governor Grant agreed to sell ranch property for development purposes. Attorney Chin continued, displaying transcripts of conversations that revealed the full extent of criminal conspiracy. These recordings show premeditated fraud, systematic harassment, and plans for crimes that would have endangered livestock and potentially human health through water supply contamination. Ella stood up during the evidence presentation with her own folder of documentation about Olivia's harassment of subdivision residents. She threatened 17 different families with fake violations, collected unauthorized fees from at least 30 households, and made up architectural standards that don't exist anywhere in our filed covenants. Ella announced to applause that shook the building's windows. We've been living under a dictator who is stealing our money while claiming legal authority she never possessed. The most damaging revelation came when Attorney Chen displayed Olivia's text messages, planning the memorial confrontation that had resulted in her arrest. Miss Sharp coordinated with associates to disrupt a family memorial service, attempted physical removal of cemetery memorial structures, and committed assault against a sitting governor while claiming enforcement authority. The prosecutor explained while showing photographs of Olivia in handcuffs. These actions demonstrate complete disregard for legal consequences and suggest ongoing danger to community members. Tom Bradley requested permission to address the community about building code violations that Olivia had been citing illegally. I've confirmed with county authorities that 60% of her violation notices cite requirements that don't exist in any municipal code, he announced while displaying official documentation. She's been threatening legal action for imaginary infractions while collecting fines for violations she invented. The community erupted in angry discussions about years of harassment based entirely on fictional regulations. By the end of Attorney Chen's presentation, residents understood they'd been victims of organized criminal fraud disguised as community leadership. Olivia hadn't been enforcing legitimate standards or protecting property values. She'd been operating a systematic theft and harassment enterprise while claiming government authority that existed only in her imagination. The woman had turned HOA leadership into a criminal conspiracy that victimized everyone who trusted her with community responsibility. Miss Sharp is currently being held without bail pending trial on federal conspiracy charges, state fraud allegations, criminal harassment, assault, and violation of court orders, Attorney Chen announced to sustained applause. Additional charges are being filed as we identify more victims and evidence of systematic criminal behavior. The prosecutor's presentation had transformed community anger into legal action that would ensure Olivia faced maximum consequences for her crimes. Jim Foster stood up with HOA financial records that revealed the full extent of Olivia's theft from community funds. Based on my analysis, she's stolen over $100,000 through fake assessments and fraudulent contracts, he announced just while residents calculated how much money they've lost to their criminal HOA president. We're filing civil lawsuits to recover stolen funds and seeking criminal restitution for financial damages to every household she victimized. The meeting concluded with unanimous votes to dissolve the existing HOA structure and establish new community leadership under legitimate legal authority. Residents had learned that HOA power depends entirely on community consent, and they were withdrawing that consent permanently from anyone who'd abuse elected position for criminal purposes. Ella was elected as interim community coordinator to oversee transition to honest leadership that would actually serve resident interests instead of personal criminal agendas. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the verdict took the jury less than 2 hours to reach. Watching Olivia Sharp sit in federal court while prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of her criminal conspiracy was like watching justice work exactly the way it's supposed to when criminals are stupid enough to document their own crimes. Martin's recordings, my security footage, financial records of stolen HOA funds, and testimony from 47 different victims had created the kind of prosecution case that defense attorneys have nightmares about. Federal Judge Harrison had been handling organized crime cases for 30 years, and his expression during sentencing suggested he'd rarely encountered someone who'd committed crimes with such systematic disregard for legal consequences. Miss Sharp, you've been convicted of federal conspiracy, fraud, criminal harassment, assault against a government official, theft of community funds, false impersonation of government authority, and violation of court orders, he announced while reviewing evidence that filled multiple filing cabinets. Your crimes demonstrate calculated abuse of public trust that requires maximum deterrent sentencing. Olivia's sentencing was everything I'd hoped for when this nightmare started with her felony trespassing in Harold's study. 2 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud, followed by 5 years probation with complete prohibition from any HOA or community leadership positions, $75,000 in criminal restitution to cover property damages, legal costs, and compensation for harassment victims. Lifetime restraining orders prohibiting any contact with ranch property or family members. The woman would never threaten another property owner again. Martin Greer's cooperation had earned him immunity from federal charges, but state prosecutors still filed business fraud allegations that would end his development consulting career permanently. His real estate license was revoked, his business partnerships dissolved, and he faced civil lawsuits from investors who'd lost money funding his criminal conspiracy with Olivia. The man who'd planned systematic harassment of government property would spend years in bankruptcy court, explaining his criminal judgment to financial creditors. The community restoration was even more satisfying than watching criminals receive their sentences. Meadowbrook residents had elected Ella as their new community coordinator, and her first official action was apologizing publicly for Olivia's harassment of Harold's ranch during our family's mourning period. Governor Grant, our community is horrified by what was done to your family in our name, she said during the ceremony where residents presented a memorial plaque honoring Harold's agricultural heritage contributions. The HOA was completely restructured under legitimate legal authority with resident oversight that would prevent future authoritarian abuse. All of Olivia's fake regulations were eliminated. Stolen community funds were recovered through criminal restitution, and new leadership was established through democratic elections rather than self-appointed dictatorship. What had been a criminal organization disguised as community leadership became actual representative governance serving resident interests. Harold's Ranch received permanent protection under state historic preservation statutes that would prevent any future development, pressure, or harassment campaigns. The family cemetery was designated as a protected heritage site with legal immunity from local zoning regulations or community standards. Our property boundaries were surveyed and recorded with Federal Geographic Services, ensuring that nobody could ever again claim authority over land that had belonged to our family since territorial establishment. The security system upgrades funded by criminal restitution payments provided comprehensive protection that would detect any future harassment attempts before they could cause property damage. Professional-grade cameras, motion sensors, and alarm systems connected directly to county law enforcement meant that Harold's Ranch was probably better protected than most government facilities. Olivia's criminal behavior had inadvertently funded security improvements that made future harassment impossible. State legislation inspired by our case established new criminal penalties for HOA abuse and false claims about government authority over private property. The Harold Grant Protection Act created felony charges for community leaders who exceed legal authority, steal community funds, or harass property owners through false regulatory claims. Other governors across the country were adopting similar legislation to protect their citizens from authoritarian community leaders. The memorial service for Harold that we had originally planned finally took place on a perfect autumn afternoon with over 200 people attending to honor his legacy and celebrate the ranch's permanent protection. Community leaders, state officials, agricultural heritage organizations, and neighbors who'd supported our family through Olivia's harassment campaign gathered to dedicate Harold's memorial bench and the new state historic marker recognizing our ranch's cultural significance. I sat on Harold's memorial bench that afternoon, looking across pastures where our family had raised cattle for 6 generations, watching visitors explore the heritage exhibits that would educate future generations about agricultural history. The fence lines were rebuilt stronger than before. The family cemetery was protected under state law, and the ranch would continue operating as Harold had intended for as long as our family wanted to maintain his legacy. Attorney Chin stopped by the memorial service to deliver final updates about ongoing prosecution of Olivia's criminal network. Additional arrests were expected as investigators identified other victims of systematic HOA fraud throughout the region. Our case had triggered federal investigations into community leadership abuse that would protect thousands of homeowners from similar criminal harassment. Harold's Ranch had become the catalyst for nationwide reform of HOA authority and accountability. The sun was setting behind Harold's commemorative oak tree when the last visitors left our memorial celebration. I walked through the ranch house one final time, touching furniture and photographs that connected 6 generations of family history to this land. Everything was exactly as Harold had left it, except now it was protected forever against anyone who might threaten our agricultural heritage or family legacy. That evening, I signed the final legal documents establishing the ranch as a permanent state agricultural heritage preserve. Harold's property would never again face development pressure, HOA harassment, or criminal conspiracy designed to force unwilling sales. The land that had fed our family since 1875 would continue serving its original purpose under legal protection that made Harold's vision permanent and unassailable. I placed the signed heritage preservation documents in Harold's old safe next to the legal papers that had protected our family through Olivia's criminal campaign. Future generations would inherit not just ranch land, but legal fortifications that would prevent anyone from ever again threatening what Harold had spent his lifetime building. Standing on Harold's front porch that night, watching stars appear over pastures that stretched to horizons unmarked by subdivision lights, I realized that justice had been served exactly as it should be. Olivia was in federal prison. Her criminal conspiracy had been completely dismantled. The community had been restored to honest leadership. And Harold's ranch was protected forever under state law. Justice took its time, grandfather, but when it came, it was complete. Maybe the real lesson here is that legacy doesn't just survive corruption, it exposes it. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you liked this one and want to support the channel, you can always hit the little thanks button below. This is why I started HOA Unfiltered, to expose the bullies, share these stories, and remind you that your home is your castle. Stay loud, stay rooted, and never let a Karen rewrite your family story. You've just experienced another crazy moment with HOA Unfiltered. Subscribe now and dive into even more chaos, laughs, and jaw-dropping tales.